Greetings and welcome to this webinar, What is American Cuisine? Presented by Professor Paul Freedman and co-sponsored by the Yale Club of Washington, D.C. and the Clubs Group of the Yale Alumni Association. I am Johnson Fluker, class of 1980, and Yale Alumni Association liaison to the Yale Club of Washington, D.C. In a moment, I will introduce you to Yale Club of Washington, D.C. Vice President Anant Raut, class of 1996, who will introduce this evening's presentation and speaker. But first, a few housekeeping notes. This webinar will be a little over 1 hour long. It is being recorded and will be archived on the Yale Alumni Association's Webinars on Demand Vimeo page. This webinar will be available in about a week. Please refer to the chat window later in the webinar for the URL to the Webinars on Demand page. The Zoom chat feature is active for this webinar and conversation with other attendees. Please locate this at the bottom of your Zoom screen and chat away. I suggest you use the speaker view for this webinar. And finally, to ask a question of tonight's speaker, please use the Q&A feature located to the left of the chat button and enter your question there. You may enter your questions at any time, and we will be reviewing them and asking them of our presenter at the end of the program. Thanks again for attending this webinar. I will now pass you on to Anant Raut. Anant?
Thank you, Johnson. Good evening and welcome to the Yale Club of Washington, D.C.'s Dinner Speaker Series. Tonight's virtual event asks, what is American cuisine? It features noted Yale professor and cuisine historian Paul Freedman. My name is Anant Raut, and I am the President Emeritus of the Yale Club of Washington. On behalf of the board and current President Yvette Rivers, thank you all for choosing to spend your evening with us. Tonight's event is made possible through the Yale Alumni Association's Red Path program, which helps connect faculty members with Yale alumni clubs throughout the country. The Yale Club of Washington, D.C. was founded in 1874 to foster a sense of community among the thousands of Yale alums now living in the Washington, D.C. area. To those of you joining us for the first time tonight, welcome. I encourage you to visit our webpage and our Facebook page to learn about some of the exciting programming we have lined up in the months ahead. And to our club members, welcome back. I think I have more memories from the Pearson Dining Hall than I do from some of the classes that I took as an undergrad. Meals shared with family and friends can transcend the food itself and become a way to bond and create memories. I joined the board of the Yale Club of Washington in part to recreate what I like to call the dining hall experience here with the alumni in the DC area. When we were deciding whom to invite for our dinner speaker series, we considered a wide range of notable faculty. Yale has some truly impressive people, luminaries in astrophysics, ancient Byzantine history, macroeconomics, just name a few of the disciplines. But those events also come with this asymmetry, in a sense that I don't know anything about this field, you're an expert, let me sit here and listen to you talk. But cuisine is the great democratizer. Everybody has an informed opinion about food. When I saw the title of one of Professor Freedman's books, 10 Restaurants That Changed America, I was ready to argue with him. I didn't even know what his 10 were. But cuisine is more than just the hottest restaurant at the moment or the toughest reservation to get. Cuisine is a response to or a reflection of broader social trends, like my dinner tonight, which I'm literally making during this webinar. Pasta, olive oil, these artisanal savory salts, crushed red pepper, kale. What were all of the trends and things that built up in the world of American cuisine to make that a dish that made sense for me here tonight? Moreover, the business model of a lot of the restaurants that we frequent is to cram as many people per square foot as possible and turn them over several times a night. How will cuisine as we know it be impacted by the global pandemic? Luckily, tonight's speaker has definitive answers to all of these questions. Paul Freedman is the Chester D. Tripp Professor of History at Yale. In 2007, Professor Freedman edited Food, The History of Taste, which won an award from the International Association of Culinary Professionals and was nominated for a James Beard Award. His talk this evening is based on his new book, American Cuisine and How It Got This Way. It is my pleasure to present to you Professor Paul Freedman.
Thank you very much, Anant, and thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm so glad to be here and to share with you some observations about not so much what American cuisine is, but what its meaning is for us. And although the book came out about 10 months ago, the obviously it couldn't cover the pandemic. So I'd be glad in the question and answer phase to talk about some impressions of what I think the future of restaurants are. And Anant was very flattering, but I can't give any definitive answers to that. But let's get started with this presentation and this book, which is called American Cuisine and How It Got This Way. So insofar as there's a question of what is American cuisine, it's a question because while we all have a good idea going into a restaurant that says it's an Italian restaurant of what we're going to find, for example, there's got to be pasta. An American restaurant could be almost anything. It could be traditional, regional, new American, Californian, eclectic, with some overtones of other cultures, other culinary cultures. So I would say the three things that characterize American cuisine in its history since the Civil War are: one, regional cuisine. Regional cuisine would be, for example, the cuisine of Louisiana. Now I can't seem to make my my slides advance. Let me try this again. Okay, so Louisiana is probably the most intact cuisine. This is the Picayune Creole Cookbook. The Picayune was one of the newspapers of New Orleans, later merged with the Times to form the Times-Picayune. And I'll talk about that image of the Black woman as the custodian of Creole cuisine just a little later. But regional in America has been largely effaced in the last really almost 100 years by the second factor, which is modernity. Modernity meaning the food that many of us grew up with: processed, standardized, and convenient. So things like Jell-O, canned soup, frozen corn, cake mixes, packaged cookies are all examples of this. They were, as we'll see very shortly, greeted as great symbols of progress, as part of the American standard of living, because they were inexpensive and they did much of the work for you. A lot of what's happened over the last 30 years has been a rebellion against the processed blandness and standardization of modernity, but that's kind of another story, and we'll talk about that soon.
Professor Freedman,
yes.
we can no longer see your slides. Can you try sharing your screen one more time and sharing the deck?
Okay. Sorry, I'm going to have to just sort of go from the beginning on this. Just give me a moment.
Take your time. Hey, everybody, we're working on some technical issues here. Thank you for your patience.
How about now? Oh, right, I have to do share screen. How are we doing?
Yay. Well done, Paul.
All right, sorry about that.
Don't you worry. Thank you very much. Okay, everyone. Bye-bye.
Okay, so the third thing, right? Regionalism, modernity. The third is variety. And variety means that the supermarket has 50,000 items, that there are 30 kinds of canned or jarred olives. It also means the eclecticism of our restaurant scene. It's been at least 120, 130 years since Americans started dining out at Chinese restaurants, Italian restaurants, the eclecticism of what used to be called ethnic restaurants, which is something that all the world now shares, but only for relatively recently. In America, this goes back to the 1890s. Okay, so regionalism, modernity, and variety. And they sort of interact or undermine each other. For example, if New Orleans and Southern Louisiana are the best preserved cuisines in the United States, they too are subject to the pressures of modernity. A supermarket in New Orleans looks pretty much like a supermarket in Seattle. And also, take a look at this image. So this is a restaurant in Lexington, Kentucky. The menu's from about the mid-1960s. The restaurant is in Lexington, Kentucky, but it's called the New Orleans House. And this menu is for a clam bake, which most people would associate with New England. And if you open up the menu, this New England clam bake includes gumbo. That's American eclecticism in miniature, in a single example. So the modernity. This is a USIS, the United States Information Service, photograph from 1957 of a woman unpacking groceries. And there was just some discussion today over the use of the word housewife. But in 1957, housewife is the advertiser's term. And you'll notice that although there's some meat there, the point of this photograph, which is to advertise the American way of life, it was particularly shown at the Zagreb commercial exposition in 1957 in what was then Yugoslavia, where there was a demonstration kitchen and groceries. And it was extraordinary because the point of this was that the ordinary American worker could buy all of this stuff, could afford all of this stuff. But all of this stuff means packaged sliced bread, meat wrapped up in plastic, cereal, canned goods. This is what made America great. And so there's, in the 1950s, certainly only a few renegades, back to the landers, frontier leftover kinds of people would have protested at this accomplishment. Modernity also is displayed in things that have very little tradition and new foods. Jell-O does have a kind of tradition from aspic. Aspic was a very tricky dish to make before artificial gelatin was invented. Jell-O in the mid-20th century was made into desserts, but also into salads. It was featured in a large number of dishes to give color, decoration. It required a lot of sugar, but was perceived as light and not heavy. It was popular with women or advertised to women and to children. This serving suggestion has a kind of a fruit Jell-O mold and then some little vegetable white Jell-Os surrounding it. But this is the food of modernity. It is colorful. It is fairly bland. It is convenient to make. It is inexpensive. And its impact, its popularity, is related to the way in which American advertisers presented their and sold their products, particularly to American women. So I didn't decide, like, for some kind of fashionable reason to include gender in this. It is inevitable in talking about why certain foods are popular in the United States and when. So an old kind of image is the wife as the provider of food, and that this satisfies her husband, that this is both her job and her pleasure and his pleasure. This is from a flour company cookbook in the 1930s. One idea, a very strong idea, is that women have to make men happy. They've got to provide a serious meal. Serious in the sense that it can't just be scrappy or improvised, and that if they don't, and advertisers were very explicit about this, if they don't provide this, their husband is going to stray. Women's magazines of the 20s, 30s, really into the 1960s, threatened their readers that if they didn't cook to satisfy their husbands would look somewhere else for that culinary and, by implication, sexual satisfaction. So there's a letter addressed to Betty Crocker, who, as you all know, was a fictitious icon of General Mills. But there was somebody who answered letters sent to Betty Crocker. One of them said, my husband likes fudge cake, but I don't. I usually make vanilla cake, but I've noticed that my neighbor makes fudge cake when we come over. Is she trying to steal my husband? So this is an extreme example of a very common notion that the advertisers use to sell their product, namely, buy our product and your husband will be pleased. But there's a little more to this. If the wife, if the housewife in the stereotypic case of the mid-20th century is too much of a drudge, too sweaty, bothered, in disarray because of the kitchen, then her husband's going to stray because she's no longer attractive. The husband wants good food, but he also wants his wife to be what one contemporary referred to as a sport. A sport means she's a fun companion. They can go for drives together, have picnics, see movies together, play golf together. Here is a pamphlet from the early 1960s for instructions for the Grand Oven Company, for a model of the Grand Company ovens, and it's cooking in the grand manner. So there are some recipes in it too. But notice this image. The guy has just come home. He's still dressed up in his suit. And she has made a meal that obviously he is enraptured by. And using this oven, she has several dishes in there, including a standing rib roast. But notice that she's dressed in a low-cut outfit. She's wearing pearls. They're going to go out after this dinner. So this is the perfect image. This is the having it all image circa 1962. Advertisers kind of appealed to, or I would say manipulated, women on both sides. You've got to provide good food, but you can't be too overcome by the process of getting it, producing it. And that's why convenience products are so good. That's why Jell-O is so good. That's why cake mix is better than making your cake from scratch, because it frees you up for your activities, your friends, your card games or tennis, as the advertisers presented it, and also satisfies your husband and makes you a good companion. Beginning of the 1960s, you have a slightly less subordinated idea. I mean, it's still subordinated, but it's got more sexual allure. So Len Dayton, I'm sure is familiar to most of you, a thriller writer, author of the Ipcress File, and he was quite an aficionado of cooking as well. And he had a kind of comic strip action cookbook that appeared in 1965. And the idea here is that men and women like cooking, and they like cooking together. So he's got a kind of James Bond look. He's messing with the pasta, and she's messing with his hair. This is the front cover, but the back cover, they've reversed it. So she's now in charge of the pasta, and he's embracing her. So these are the gender roles of modernity. And of course, they've changed a lot. Men do more cooking. How much is partly related to the whole question of who's in charge of housework, who takes care of children, and the like. Variety. I'm going to spend most of the rest of my time on this subject. Variety, remember, is in two forms. One is the brand eclecticism, the fact that there's so many different foods in the supermarket. And the other is ethnic eclecticism. This, as I said before, was a feature of American tastes beginning in the 1880s, 1890s. Americans who were not Chinese started eating at Chinese restaurants that had originally been set up for the immigrant community. They started eating at Italian restaurants, more or less the same thing. Americans, newspapers and magazines boasted as early as 1895, 1900, that while Paris might have better food than New York or Los Angeles, you could have every cuisine of the world in the American cities. For a long time, France had no interest in this. If you look at the Guide Michelin for Paris in 1965, there are 340 restaurants, only about 6 are foreign. There are all kinds of different Parisian French restaurants. There's some that are Provençal, Occitan, Alsatian. But the notion that a French person would actually go out and decide they're going to eat Thai food is foreign to the French mentality until recently. Well, here's a sign from Poitiers for a place, as you see, called Tacos and Company. And they have a tongue-in-cheek, authentic French: tacos, burger, panini. Now, tacos and panini are not American. The burger is, obviously. But tacos and panini did not arrive in Poitiers via Mexico or Italy directly. They arrived with the intermediation of the United States, because it's the United States that developed all of these different things. So they don't have pizza, they don't have sushi, but they may as well. The same thing in many other cities. So Barcelona, which is the city I know best in my job as a medieval historian, I remember when sushi came to Barcelona. And it came in the form of restaurants run by Japanese people, but it was made popular by American tastes. And American tastes, as I said, have been eclectic for a long time. This is the Pekin Noodle House, advertising chop suey. This is the oldest Chinese restaurant in continuous operation in the United States. It's in Butte, Montana. And unfortunately, I'm told it's not very good. I'd still love to have an excuse to go there sometime. The Chinese experience is one that shows that Americans can love the food of other people without actually admiring or even treating them decently. The big jump in popularity of Chinese food came in 1897 when the visit of a Chinese government officer to New York sparked an interest in what he supposedly was served to him, and that was chop suey. In fact, chop suey, which is actually a genuine Chinese dish, though its American version has almost no relation to the Chinese origin, was the most popular Chinese dish from 1897 until it started dying out in the 1960s. And my students have never heard of it, and my current students, so I have to explain what it is. Anybody of a certain age, however, will remember this. So the chop suey craze, as it was called at the time, beginning in 1897, coincided with draconian, harsh laws against Chinese immigration that go back to the 1880s. The Chinese Exclusion Act, as it was non-euphemistically called, prohibited most categories of Chinese immigration because the Chinese were unfair competition to American workers. We see the same thing now with regard to Mexican restaurants. It's perfectly possible for someone to dine at Mexican restaurants frequently and still regard the southern border of the United States as a danger zone and to advocate for restricted immigration. After the 1920s, all sorts of other cuisines get introduced. The reason I included this menu from the Bombay India Inn in New York, which is from the 1940s, is this little item. See below the picture, where foods are prepared by an experienced Hindu chef. So this is an appeal to authenticity. We, and by we, I mean Americans who are not part of the ethnic group that is identified with the restaurant. So we want to have authentic foods, and restaurants cater to this by messages like the chef is Hindu, the chef is from India. Or more recently, Xi'an Famous Foods, which is a little chain in New York that has wonderful Chinese food, particularly from Xi'an and from Western China. For a while, they hired only cashiers who didn't speak English. They had to know English numbers, but otherwise, the owner of the company said it makes it seem more authentic. So there are all sorts of tricks to make things seem more authentic. On the other hand, things can't be too authentic because Americans actually don't like chicken feet. Americans don't like organ meat. There are all sorts of things in every foreign cuisine that Americans aren't actually going to put up with. So you have to jolly them along if you're a restaurant owner. You have to sort of pretend that what you have is authentic, at least in most cases. In some cases, particularly in the past, they didn't even try, or it was comical. So this is a restaurant called the Punjab. So look here, we've got foods from the Far East. And Punjab says, just to the right of the red foods from the Far East, try a king-size martini. I don't know of anyone who really thought that martinis go with Indian food, but so what? And he also has food from France. A bottle of what is referred to as Vin de Blanc goes very well, and Chianti with foods from sunny Italy. So the Punjab restaurant is not making an insanely careful effort to create authenticity. Now, there's a lot at stake here with regard to authenticity. If we go back to that Picayune Creole cookbook, this is the second edition from 1905. And in this preface, which is too small, the writing to read, but the preface says basically that the old slaves or former slaves were the guardians, the custodians of Creole cuisine. And now that they are dying out, this cookbook is intended to preserve the recipes of this generation of African-American cooks who were the exponents, if not the inventors, of this cuisine. In the South, in the early 20th century, in the late 19th century, they were perfectly happy, indeed celebrated the role of African Americans. As long as they were politically and socially subordinated, they were praised as the guardians and custodians of traditional food. As the South became more self-conscious about its laws, customs, the injustices of segregation, they the white Southerners tended to write Black people out of the history of Southern food. And Southern food and regional food in the South was whitened. So if you look at the 1947 edition of the Creole Cookbook, the putative author of the cuisine is a French chef. He's wearing a hat, he's white, he has little mustaches, and the preface now talks about the role of the French nobility even, and their employees at creating this cuisine. This is similar to a phenomenon that I noticed immediately when I lived in Nashville from 1979 to 1997. In the first years, if you went to plantation houses, there was no reference made to slavery. It was as if the way of life of this place was maintained somehow by invisible automatons. And if you asked about slaves, they would say, "Oh well, those houses were built very flimsily, so there's nothing left of them." And that's about as good as they can do. So a lot of what has been going on in culinary history is it's not so much the restoration of appreciating a Black role. African American people themselves never forgot this, but of the re-entry into a kind of mainstream of the African American role in not only creating Southern food, but really in creating American food as a whole. So I have talked a lot about the 20th century. Going into the 21st century, we are the heirs of the food revolution that began in the 1970s, and that's identified perhaps more than with any single other author with Alice Waters, the owner of Chez Panisse in Berkeley, California. But this was a movement that was generalized. The accomplishment of Alice Waters in particular, it seems to me, is not just creating a new kind of gourmet food based on season, locality, locavore, seasonal food, but on food being delicious as well as ethical and healthful. When I was a college student, I went to a place in New Jersey for a year that will not be unfamiliar to you, and then transferred because I didn't like it to University of California at Santa Cruz. And there was already, this would be in the 1970, 1971, an ethos of Diet for a Small Planet, which came out in 1970. This is the notion that you should eat in an ecologically responsible way. But the food was actually not very good. It tended to be, unpleasant and good for you. It was the accomplishment of Alice Waters to make food that was healthful, environmentally responsible, local, and delicious. That in fact a peach without any addition that was actually from a local tree in the proper season was more delicious than some kind of elaborate dish with Miracle Whip and canned peaches. And that seems to be so obvious now. But I hope that in talking about modernity and some of these other things, I've shown a little bit what people were up against. And of course, what's happened is that chefs went from being just kind of efficient artisans to celebrities. Emeril is included here because he's really the person who changed food TV, thanks to the Food Network, from a kind of informational program. Even wonderful and charismatic figures like Julia Child were still actually teaching you how to cook. Beginning with Emeril, men start watching it, men who aren't cooks, kids, teenagers. Iron Chef really is the next step beyond Emeril in making food a form of entertainment, in making food a form of social positioning, of showing off, to put it simply. And, I can't criticize that because I wouldn't have an audience. I wouldn't sell books if it wasn't for that. I wouldn't have a lot of students in my courses. The challenge in the COVID and post-COVID world is what is going to happen to not only restaurants, but to celebrity chefs, to the whole way in which we think about food and what food means to us. I'd say an optimistic scenario would be that many people have learned again how to cook after years of basically takeout or restaurant food. But I'm not confident of that at all. So I'll leave the 21st century maybe for the Q&A. Also, anything that I've raised in this talk, naturally. But thank you all for being here. I think in the excitement of trying to get my slides in order, I neglected to thank Yvette and Anand of the Washington, D.C. Yale Club for the invitation and for the very kind participation in this, and for the AYA for its sponsorship and for all that it does for the faculty as well as the alumni. So I'm ready for questions.
Thanks, Paul. This is Johnson. Anand?
Okay, so sure. Yeah, we had a little digestive issue over here. Professor Freedman, I'm just going to go through some of the questions in the Q&A. We've had a couple that I'm going to kind of bundle together. You said that you were going to start talking about cuisine post-Civil War. We have a couple questions. Why did you pick that as your starting point, and what would you characterize cuisine as like before that?
Great. So after the Civil War is when many of the large food companies that remain familiar to us today were founded. So there's a process of business consolidation and of technology. So after the Civil War, canning gets to be much better. Refrigerated railroad cars, the Transcontinental Railroad, the development of California as a place where a huge amount of fruit and vegetables are grown and then transported elsewhere. So Kraft, Heinz, Nabisco, Campbell's, all of these companies date from this period. So it's really the development of modernity and the beginning of the erosion of regionality. Before the Civil War, most people lived on farms and made a lot of their own, grew, raised, and processed a lot of their own food. That certainly is not true for the cities. There was a very elegant American cuisine. There was a lot of borrowing from France. In my book, 10 Restaurants That Changed America, that Anand referred to, the first restaurant I describe as Delmonico's, which was created in the 1830s. But generally speaking, if you look at the cookbooks at that time, they assume that you have access to an awful lot of meat, fruit, and vegetables that you yourself have cultivated.
Thank you, Professor Freedman. We have another question from Bonnie. She was wondering what you do think will happen to restaurants post-pandemic.
I'm afraid that at least half of them will close. There's an article today, I can't remember if it's in the Wall Street Journal or New York Times, that if businesses haven't reopened by now, they're very likely never going to reopen. And restaurants simply have not ever had a whole lot of reserves. Many of you will have seen the article by Gabriel Hamilton, the owner of a restaurant in New York called Prune. So this is someone who has won, I don't know, 4 or 5 James Beard Awards, had a TV show. The restaurant is packed every night, was packed every night. She said that she didn't have health insurance because she couldn't afford it. Mm. So this is a restaurant that's running already on fumes. You've read that the businesses that are going under, at least first, are the ones that were already in trouble. And restaurants in places like New York, to some extent in DC, certainly in San Francisco, certainly in LA, in any place where they're paying a huge amount in rent, are, very close to falling over the edge. The restaurants that will survive tend to be ones that already did a lot of takeout or outdoor dining. So, a barbecue place in rural Alabama where people drive up, order, and eat it on picnic tables, this is not going to have any trouble, relatively speaking. Chinese restaurants. On the one hand, they're used to takeout. They're also very resourceful and adaptable. On the other hand, the Chinese have been the object of tremendous prejudice because of the origin of the COVID virus, and a lot of Chinese restaurants in rural areas have been buffets, and buffets are now out. So I've been pessimistic. I will say this, the restaurants will come back once the epidemic is over, but they may not come back under the same people who had them before. In other words, the temptation to open restaurants will return. Rents may be lower, there may be a lot more opportunities, but it'll be hard for people who are wiped out to start again. It's been very discouraging for them.
Thank you, Professor. We have another question, anonymous. Putting aside the natural choice of Philadelphia, what are your favorite American dining cities?
Okay. I love LA, partly because it's so vast and therefore sort of secret. It's no accident, although he's very talented, of course, that Jonathan Gold is the only newspaper food writer to have won a Pulitzer Prize. I love San Francisco. I'm impressed at the ability of people in a place that's even more expensive than New York to stay in business. I'd say Baltimore, which I don't know as much about, but partly the Chesapeake Bay region remains one of the richest in terms of products that I like, the kind of seafood, for example, and so Baltimore.
Thank you. Okay, so a question from Lauren Smith. You've referenced cuisine from about 1880. What was American cuisine like before that? All regional and driven by what was available in the area?
Not entirely. So it depends on the class. The upper class looked to France. So Delmonico's, for example, or Antoine's in New Orleans, both called themselves French restaurants. If you actually look at their menu, first of all, Antoine's is more Creole. They have things like pompano, sea turtle, things that are unknown in France. And Delmonico's served what were then considered great American specialties, things like terrapin, which is Chesapeake Bay turtles, or wild ducks, particularly a kind of large wild duck called a canvasback duck. These are the two great luxury dishes of America, recognized by travelers from Europe and from Britain as American specialties. So there was a kind of national cuisine, but it was very different from what we're familiar with now. For example, steak was not a big item. The hamburger obviously is a later invention, the hot dog as well, and of course pizza doesn't really come in until, as a national food at least, until considerably later. So you have regional foods. You have, if you had to say what it was most like, it's most like English food. And I know that's kind of disillusioning because English food doesn't have a good reputation, but like American food, that bad reputation is more a kind of mid-20th century phenomenon and is not something that can be read back all that long before then.
Okay, thank you. So Bonnie had a question. She was referring to your slide on the Creole cuisine representational changes, and she said it reminds her of the work being done at the Smithsonian on crediting African American and Native American influences on American food. Do you have any comments on that, on the work that they've done?
Yes, if I might be forgiven a boast, one of the people who is working on that and who works at the Smithsonian is Ashley Young, who is a Yale graduate, a BA, and a student of mine who received her PhD from Duke, and her first job out of the PhD program is at the Smithsonian. And she's very, very involved in that. Yes, yes, indeed.
Thank you. Okay, we have another question from Chun Yang. Do you perceive an increase in Americans' food consciousness through the prevalence of reality food television? How has that impacted the debate over cuisine authenticity?
Well, cuisine authenticity and TV have some of the same kind of funny relationship that authenticity in the hands of restaurant owners do. Reality TV tries to create things like contests, like competition, drama. And the authenticity that it creates is particularly the pressure of the kitchen. So one of the things that reality TV has been very good at is showing the chefs yelling, misbehaving, their tantrums. It's collided into the #MeToo movement. And so if you look at the kinds of people who are considered celebrity chefs who are fawned over by the media merely 10 years ago, people like Mario Batali or John Betch, people who are now been canceled or semi-canceled, it's a little disingenuous of the media to say they're shocked to discover that Mario Batali was a jerk. This was something that they celebrated. The heavily tattooed, loud music playing, the hell with you chef, the bad boy, male, the gods of food of Time magazine. This now is embarrassing suddenly. So, reality TV is very good at adjusting. If the quiz shows were shown to be fake, then they could turn them into entertainment. TV can always make things into entertainment and shrug off with a few sacrificial victims the finding that its previous model was unenlightening. I hope that answers the question. It's not just, I hate it when people just use a question as an excuse for their own rants, but I'll try to stick to the questions.
No, it's all good. All right, so we have a question from Caroline. What are some relatively understudied regional cuisines of the U.S. that we foodies should know about?
Well, I love the work of Jane and Michael Stern, the road food that has been through 10 editions. Jane Stern they met at Yale. Jane was I think a fine arts student. So they discovered all sorts of, they're regional, but they're what I call vernacular food. So something like Cincinnati chili is not something that comes out of the soil. Hardy farmers or early immigrants didn't invent it. It was invented by a guy who came from Macedonia and who opened up a restaurant and mixed spaghetti with chili, and it took off. So a lot of these things, Nashville hot chicken is another invented dish, key lime pie. So in terms of an underappreciated region, the Midwest generally, although it is appreciated, maybe its full richness is not the Southwest.
Thank you. So another question, another good one. Do you anticipate a shift in culinary tastes as people remain at home? And when would we see the impact of that? Like in 5 years, 10 years, 25 years?
Yeah, I don't think it's going to be quite that long. As I said, an optimistic scenario would be that people rediscover how to cook. And I think if you cook for yourself, you appreciate what food is more, including food that you eat at restaurants. So I'm a believer in that. I do most of the cooking in my household, not because I'm particularly talented, but at least I have a lot of practice. The first reaction was partly panic, right? People bought beans dried beans, who hadn't bought dried beans in decades. Excuse me. Comfort food, because we have a lot we need a lot of comfort.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd say there are two reactions. One is comfort and the other is experimentation. Finally, you have time, if you want, to look at those recipes. Most people who take cooking seriously, let's say they have 30 cookbooks, they only use 2 or 3 regularly. So it gives you a chance to try some recipes from those cookbooks that you always wanted to try. What's going to happen when things return to normal depends when things return to normal. Obviously, it's gone on longer than we hoped. The trajectory is not favorable. This affects restaurants most of all, but it also affects our food habits. And so the simple answer is I don't know, but things go both ways. There's some people who have found that they've lost weight under the quarantine because they're now controlling the food and portion size. There's some people who have, I've heard reference to the COVID-19, that is the 19 pounds that people have gained.
So another question from Helen Mao. What is the origin or the cause of fusion food as a trend?
This fits into what I was saying about eclecticism and authenticity. So authenticity is not so strong that people, including chefs, but particularly the dining public, aren't tempted by the idea of mixing it up. Mixing it up meaning, Asian and French, a French food with yuzu, or Japanese food with béarnaise sauce.
Thank you, professors. Okay, Patrick has a question. What do you make of the trend towards plant-based meat that we're seeing in the US today?
I think it's very important, and if it is accepted, that is, if people regard it as something more than a weird novelty and start buying it, and then it will change the environmental disaster, one of the environmental disasters involved in deforestation and the environmental costs of pasturing animals and keeping animals. The question really is, how can you do something more than burgers? So there's plant-based meat, and then there's artificially, chemically reconstructed, cultivated meat. The latter is more promising because it can mimic tissue and the texture of meat. But I've eaten at Superiority Burger in New York, for example, and that is often ranked as the best plant-based meat retail sale, and I gotta say, incredible.
Okay, we have a question from Jennifer Lyman. She says, obviously we've moved beyond chop suey in Chinese food. We now appreciate, at least some of us do, the vast regional variation in Chinese cuisine. How would you say that has developed here?
Yes. I am glad that you asked that question, because one of the ways that food of other countries is made more authentic is by regionalism. So this goes back with Chinese food, certainly to the 1970s, and the vogue for Sichuan food and then Hunan food, which was accompanied by a rejection of chop suey as inauthentic and a kind of marginalization of Cantonese food. The same thing happened with Italian. So what is now called red sauce Italian was just Italian up until the 70s, and then you start discovering Northern Italian food, the food of the Veneto, the food of Lombardy, the food of Piemonte, and so forth. So this is more authentic, but it doesn't necessarily release the cuisine from this dynamic of authentic but satisfying people. So General Tso's chicken is like the chop suey of the late 20th, early 21st century. It's something that people know isn't authentic. If you want to see a wonderful movie about Chinese food, there's one called The Search for General Tso. It's more important than the title would indicate, but it does have a scene at a museum in Hunan province dedicated to the real General Tso, who is a figure of the Taiping Rebellion in the mid-19th century. And interviewers ask people leaving the museum if they're aware that there's a dish in the United States called General Tso's chicken. And not only are they aware of it, but they're angry. How dare they? There's no such thing in China, needless to say. Or if there is, it's been re-imported or imported from the United States. And so the regional, there's the food available to us now is much more authentic, much more varied regionally. I think it's tastier, but it isn't the same. Again, the Chinese love organ meat. They like all sorts of special effects with tofu that either you can't charge enough for, or that are very hard to make because silken tofu, which is the only kind they use in China, is hard to manipulate. So there are all sorts of things that aren't going to show up, and that's fine. Chinese food in America is a cuisine of its own.
Interesting. Okay, so we have another question from Catherine. She says, how would you answer my French friend's question? What are typical American dishes?
On the one hand, I could mention things like pot roast or apple pie or, turkey and cranberry sauce. But most of these things actually people don't eat, except maybe on Thanksgiving in the case of turkey. That is, when was the last time you made a pot roast? I'm sure some of you are aficionados of this, but a lot of what are considered to be, if I had to name classic American dishes to somebody from France, I would start naming all sorts of things that would be tough to find. I mean, apple pie, where would you go? Even diners don't always have it. Pies generally are not as popular as they used to be, either in homes or in restaurants. There are all sorts of dishes that people know about, coconut cream pie or custard, Boston baked beans, that it's not just that they're fading, they're almost extinct in terms of looking at what people eat every day. If you look at what people eat every day, it's pizza, burgers, pasta, salads, tuna fish. What can I tell you?
Yeah. Or we have a great question also from Elsa. First of all, she thanked you for the presentation. She's asked, do you think a majority of Americans will shift to vegetarian diets anytime soon?
No, but I think a substantial proportion will, or they will have a vegetable-forward diet. So strict vegetarian, not in any imminent scenario that I can see. But people have already shifted a lot from considering that a meal isn't a meal, or at least dinner is not a dinner without meat, to something else, to what's referred to as vegetable forward, which means considering vegetables more than just a side dish. Definitely the popularity of dishes like ratatouille, shakshuka, all sorts of things that don't involve meat and can be served for main courses. Obviously, a huge number of pasta dishes.
Another great question here from Jennifer. She says, do you think the pandemic has encouraged people to do more locally oriented procurement from farmers markets and locally produced food?
Yes, and the farmers have been trying to sell to consumers what previously they were selling to restaurants. So the kinds of craft farmers who show up at farmers markets are in terrible trouble because many of them supplied high-end vegetables and fruit to restaurants, and the restaurants aren't buying. So that's a pivot that's not easy, because yeah, sure, I'd love to buy food. There are some farmers markets in Westchester, very near where I live, but I'm not going to buy crates and crates of kohlrabi or squash blossoms the way restaurants did.
Interesting. So Melissa Chan has a question. We'll just do a few more questions before we wrap up, but Melissa has a great one. The pandemic has underscored the inequality in America and exacerbated it. And there are some Americans who've had the time to make their sourdough breads and cook at home, and many others, particularly essential workers who are living paycheck to paycheck, are already in debt. To what extent will this create more of a kind of two classes of American cuisine?
Well, I think it will continue and exacerbate, just as your question implies, a trend that was already happening. So people with leisure and an interest in food have been cooking and discovering restaurants. And the people who don't have a lot of extra money or have to have more than one job to make ends meet have not shared in that. What I will say, and this comes up a lot in discussions of restaurants, is that the flourishing of restaurants is not a symbol of equality. Restaurants are built on inequality. Some people can afford to eat at them and not. Some people don't need to save the money by cooking at home, let alone by buying ramen or a hamburger helper in order to stretch food. So I applaud efforts of restaurants to pay a living wage, to try to think about how people in the back of the house, in the kitchen, can be rewarded commensurate with what the front of the house is rewarded for racial justice. But I think we need to keep in mind that restaurants are built on inequality. Just as, you know, I applaud Yale's successful efforts to be more inclusive, but, you know, Yale wasn't built on egalitarian foundations.
Okay, we had another question about from the anonymous person. It says, you talked about how in the 1950s, cooking was very much the province of wives or women. Can you discuss how that turned into a very male-oriented celebrity chef culture?
Cooking was always odd because the domestic version was in the hands of women largely, and the professional version in the hands of men. There are some parallels. For example, for a long time, doctors were male, but the family's health was taken care of by women. But in fact, doctors now, a very large percentage of them are female, and there are more women than men in medical schools. So, until recently, and really still, I think only 7 to 10% of professional chefs are female. So this is a paradox that goes back a long way. You do get in the 20th century cookbooks addressed to men. They're all what now would be called weekend cooks. So the Playboy cookbook, for example, from 1972, says men are more creative. They're more risk takers. Women have been kind of bowed down by the drudgery of food. Plot twist, women don't really like food. They're worried about their diets. They fuss about food. They have to, you know, the combination of obligation and preoccupation with dieting. So, I mean, needless to say, this is sexist, it's ridiculous, but there's a whole genre, Esquire, Playboy, it's sort of implicit in that Len Dayton book as well. There's a whole genre of cookbooks for men, but the whole point of them is that the men can cook when they feel like it. But women who are married and have a family have to put something on the table 2 or 3 times a day.
Well, thank you, Professor Freedman. I would like to turn the presentation back over to Anant.
Professor Freedman, we have time for one final question. You have talked about how trends in cuisine oftentimes reflect broader trends in society. And Michelle Maybury asks a very interesting question. What is your takeaway on the rise of natural eating trends like paleo, ketogenic, Whole30? Do they reflect something broader we're seeing in society?
I think some of these trends are commendable. Some of them are part of one of the aspects of modernity that I didn't talk about, but is extensively dealt with in my book, and that is health. The idea of health is always that there's some miracle food or some food that's so bad that if you stay away from it, it'll save your life. So examples of the first are, paleo diet, so protein or meat, or flaxseed or oat bran. Dangerous foods, eggs for a while were dangerous. And oh, no, we made a mistake. That's actually okay. So these diets are part of an American desire to have to have something that works instantly. And unfortunately, we see this with the vaccine as well. There's got to be something that scientific professionals will bring us that will allow us to eat what we want and not gain weight. And excuse me, but this hasn't happened so far.
Great. Well, with that, I want to thank the over 200 attendees for spending their dinner hour with the Yale Club of Washington, D.C. tonight. If you've enjoyed these kinds of book talks, later on this week, tomorrow actually, we are doing another webinar on Atomic Spy, The Dark Lives of Klaus Fuchs, the spy post-World War II. And next month, we'll have Jim Sciutto, class of 1992 from CNN, to talk about his forthcoming book, The Madman Theory, Trump Takes on the World. Again, on behalf of the Yale Club of Washington, D.C., Board of Directors and President Yvette Rivers, I'd like to thank everyone for attending tonight. I want to thank again the Yale Alumni Association for making this possible, and please join me in thanking virtually Professor Paul Freedman for just an excellent talk, fascinating subject. Thank you so much for spending time with us tonight.
Thank all of you. I really had a very good time.